Welcome to this week's Resilience by Default Deep Dive podcast. Today we're exploring a truly massive shift in global defense strategy outlined in Terry's article. You know, if you've been following international security at all lately, you already know the landscape is changing at lightning speed. But the sheer scale of the structural changes we're looking at today, it's absolutely unprecedented. We're going to break down how the very concept of national defense is being fundamentally rewritten. It's moving far beyond the traditional battlefield and landing squarely in our own domestic infrastructure, all through a concept we call resilience by default.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the new NATO baseline, unpack that 5% spending split, and look at the 4 distinct pillars of resilience. Then we'll see how this translates into the UK Defence Readiness Bill, tackle the private sector dilemma, and wrap up with what a whole-of-society shift actually means for us.
All right, Section 1, the new NATO baseline. To really grasp this global paradigm shift, we've got to look back at the 2025 NATO Summit in The Hague. Terry's article highlights that the agreements made there directly operationalize NATO's Article 3 obligations. Now, that's the strict requirement for member states to build up their own capacity to resist an armed attack. But here's the catch. How they actually do that has totally changed. Leaders at the summit explicitly recognize that modern conflict isn't just about tanks and troops anymore. It is heavily dominated by gray zone warfare. Things like massive disinformation campaigns, devastating cyber attacks, and crippling supply chain vulnerabilities. The core realization here is resilience by default. It's this hard truth that a frontline military is really only ever as strong as the domestic home front supporting it.
Moving right along to Section 2, the 5% split.
So, the overarching goal set for NATO allies is, frankly, incredibly ambitious. Member states have pledged to dedicate a massive 5% of their total GDP to defense-related investments by the year 2035. That is a huge amount of capital. But, as Terry's article rightly points out, it's not just about throwing more money at fighter jets. How that single 5% number is ultimately divided up, that is the true game changer for domestic policy.
Here's exactly how that breaks down. NATO allies agreed to split this funding into 2 very distinct streams. You've got 3.5% of GDP ring-fenced for those core traditional military capabilities we usually think of. But notice that remaining slice. A full 1.5% of GDP is carved out specifically and explicitly for broader national resilience, civil preparedness, and security measures.
Which brings us nicely to Section 3, 4 pillars of resilience. We need to define what that 1.5% actually covers in terms of non-traditional systemic defense, because we aren't just talking about vague ideas of readiness here. According to the Hague Summit Declaration, detailed in Terry's article, this funding allocation is firmly built upon 4 explicit pillars. Let's walk through them real quick.
Pillar number 1 focuses entirely on civil preparedness and resilience. This is all about developing genuine civilian readiness for military crises. It means ensuring societal continuity, basically making sure everyday life doesn't just entirely collapse during a conflict, creating mechanisms to rapidly scale up emergency responses, and ensuring public sector resilience across the board.
The second pillar is critical infrastructure protection. We are literally talking about securing the lifeblood of the nation against physical and cyber disruptions. This covers everything: power grids, transport networks, seaports, airports, major pipelines, and our vital health systems. Because let's be real, if these go down, the military simply cannot function.
Next up, the third pillar, network defense. In our digital age, this one is absolutely paramount. This pillar is completely dedicated to strengthening nationwide cyber defenses, safeguarding enormous data centers, and protecting our telecommunications infrastructure against highly sophisticated, state-sponsored attacks.
And finally, the 4th pillar targets the defense industrial base. A nation has to be able to produce what it needs to defend itself, right? So this involves drastically scaling up domestic manufacturing capacity, ensuring ironclad supply chain security, and guaranteeing the sovereign in-house production of ammunition and essential defense material.
All right, into Section 4, the UK Defence Readiness Bill.
So how does a massive international pledge made over in The Hague become a domestic legislative reality right here in the UK? Well, Terry's article notes that the UK is moving incredibly fast on this front. The House of Commons Defence Committee actually launched a targeted inquiry to figure this out, specifically looking at the UK's Article 3 obligations and the upcoming Defence Readiness Bill.
They are working intensely to map out exactly how the UK will meet that 1.5% resilience target and what statutory powers will actually be required to make it happen.
And the primary objective of this upcoming bill is absolutely critical. It seeks to establish a firm legal and operational framework for something termed civil assistance to military authority. Think about it. In the event of a major conflict with a peer adversary, the military is going to fundamentally rely on civilian infrastructure and services just to operate. This bill aims to lay the legal groundwork to make that civil-military cooperation both seamless and mandatory.
But as we hit Section 5, the private sector dilemma, we uncover a massive hurdle. Hitting this 1.5% target isn't just about the government writing a check. Look at the stark contrast in how this money is managed. That 3.5% for traditional military spending, it's neatly and historically managed by one single entity, the Ministry of Defense. Clean and simple, but that 1.5% for civil resilience, it is incredibly fractured. It requires coordinated contributions from the Cabinet Office, the Home Office, the Department for Transport, DSIT, and even private utility companies. Trying to coordinate funding and policy across all these different entities has historically been a massive friction point for the UK government.
And this leads us straight into the biggest debate currently happening among policy experts, which Terry's article dives into, because the vast majority of the UK's critical national infrastructure, I'm talking our telecommunications, our energy grids, our water and food supplies, is entirely privately owned. We have a huge accounting problem on our hands. Think about it. If a private utility company spends tens of millions on capital investments to meet strict government-mandated resilience and cybersecurity targets, should that private money count toward the UK's collective 1.5% GDP commitment to NATO? It's a super complex dilemma sitting right at the intersection of private enterprise and national security.
Ultimately, this brings us to Section 6, a whole-of-society shift.
Navigating this highly complex implementation across both government and private sectors highlights the core thesis of Terry's article. This 1.5% commitment is so much more than just a budget increase. It represents a total paradigm shift for UK defense policy. It demands that we move away from treating security purely as an overseas military deployment issue. Instead, we have to treat national security as a structural, whole-of-society baseline. By fully embracing resilience by default, the heavy responsibility for national defense is now actively shared by government departments, private companies, and civil society alike. We're all in this together. So, this leaves us with a critical question to consider about our own readiness. As the lines between civilian infrastructure and military necessity continue to blur, is our local infrastructure truly prepared to support this whole-of-society baseline? It's a question that is absolutely going to define the next decade of domestic policy and investment. Podcasts released every Tuesday on Spotify and YouTube. Like, subscribe, and repost. It helps us build the channel and focus on what's important to you.